I've always been skeptical about DNA tests and didn't take them seriously. Why do they do them at all? But then I found out what they were for. And thanks to a DNA test, I discovered that my wife was being unfaithful. I was sitting in my office late on a Friday, reviewing several applicants who had learned about an upcoming opening in our office staff. I served as the regional head of a chemical company that provided chemicals for weed control, fertilizers, and water containment for soil. Our business relied heavily on farmers who cultivated the food we consume. With the push for greener practices, we were the first company to have our products certified as 100% environmentally safe. Recently, 2 husbands of my office staff received promotions from their employers, leading them to submit their resignations. Both would be relocating within the next 3 months, creating urgency to find replacements as quickly as possible. Our sales team operated across 8 states in the heart of flyover country, and our sales growth this year far exceeded expectations. Kathy, my executive assistant, popped her head into my office and announced, "Ed, all 8 candidates have confirmed their interview times for Monday. I'm heading out now, so good night." Every Thursday, I travel to one of the states in my region to conduct a half-day sales meeting on Friday before returning home. As a result, Thursday evenings have become my wife's night out with her friends, accumulating significant babysitting costs over the years. These weekly trips provided our sales representatives with essential personal support for addressing job-related issues and performance challenges. This approach had proven highly effective, as I hadn't lost a single team member in 8 years, a notable achievement for the company. I had just returned today in time to review a few matters before heading home. The company had been pressuring me for years to relinquish that part of my job. However, I valued the solitude it provided, allowing me to think things through on my own. With a know-it-all wife and 3 kids, the quiet time I had while driving was invaluable. Plus, it prevented our branch from needing to hire a sales manager. I had a track record of staying under budget, and I wanted to maintain that. With all our children in junior and senior high school, and my eldest daughter, my pride and joy, set to graduate and start at Southeast Missouri University in the fall, things were looking promising for our family. She received a full scholarship from my employer. My youngest daughter had just turned 16 and was busy preparing to get her learner's permit. Grace, my wife of 20 years, had been the executive assistant to the district attorney since before our youngest was born. The district attorney had recently accepted a new position as a federal lawyer, a decision that seemed wise considering it offered double the salary. He would begin in 4 months. I had never quite understood him. Although he was about my age, he had never married. Despite the rumors, I didn't believe he was gay. For the last 15 years, my parents had been picking up my 3 children every second weekend to give my wife and me some quality time together. When they first started this routine, both Grace and I were at a pivotal point in our marriage. My parents believed we needed some private time without the kids around. I must say it was the best gift they could have given us, as it allowed my wife and me to reconnect. Without their support, we might have become just another divorce statistic. They had about 3 months before this arrangement had to end, as Amy, my eldest, would be working in our senator's office in Washington for the summer before starting her studies in political science. Some time ago, my dad playfully purchased Ancestry.com kits for our 3 children, with my permission, and submitted them as a joke. According to the guidelines, we understood that a match would only occur if someone related to them had also submitted their DNA to the program. My children discussed it with me, and I approved, noting that we all have distant relatives we may not remember or know about. It could lead to an exciting new adventure. Amy suggested we keep the results a surprise for their mother until we received them, knowing it could take 5 to 6 months to get an answer. This weekend, we were heading to Nashville to experience the Grand Ole Opry and would return home on Sunday. My wife had organized this special trip as a way for us to create another cherished memory together. I met my wife, Grace, during my final year of university at a football game. I wasn't one of the players on the field. Instead, I was one of the faceless vendors selling overpriced food to fans in the stands. Grace was one of the youngest daughters of the medical coaches and always received free tickets. During the game, she got into an argument with her date over something trivial that they both misinterpreted. Things escalated quickly, and I found myself caught in the middle. She pushed her date aside, and in the process, he stumbled back into me, knocking me down the concrete stairs with my food tray flying alongside me. The next thing I knew, I woke up in the hospital with my head bandaged. The doctor informed me I had received 25 stitches due to a split forehead. Feeling guilty, Grace visited me daily to check on my recovery. By the time I was starting to regain consciousness, she had met my entire family. I later learned that I had been in a coma for almost a week due to internal injuries. As my vision gradually cleared, I saw a beautiful stranger before me. At first, I thought I had arrived at the pearly gates, and she was my guardian angel. Then I recognized my girlfriend standing next to her. Esmeralda was not impressed by this vision. I closed my eyes and slipped back into sleep, hoping that Esmeralda would be gone when I woke up, and that this was all just a dream. When I finally awoke, the dream persisted, but Esmeralda was no longer there. She had chosen to find someone new to lavish her attention on, and I felt that God had answered my prayers favorably. Grace stayed by my side, asking for nothing as I gradually put my life back together. Without explicitly asking her, we began dating, and one thing led to another. After graduation, I went into sales while she secured her first job as an executive assistant. At one of her family gatherings, her little cousin asked her why she wasn't married yet, to which she replied, "Because Ed hasn't asked me." 3 months later, I stood at the altar, watching the goddess approach me. At 5'8" with long blonde hair, deep blue-black eyes, and a figure that made men swoon, Grace and I exchanged vows. However, by our 5th year of marriage, we had both reached a point where we felt ready to walk away. To this day, I still don't understand why or how we were being driven apart, and as far as I knew, neither did she. We had just left Lambert's on our way home, a restaurant that I felt relied too much on its reputation. The main attraction was the tossing of their gigantic buns across the room for customers to catch, while the rest of their food was just overcooked and outdated. We had stopped at this tourist trap because it reminded my wife of her mother's cooking. Need I say more? For some reason, my wife reached over and turned off our sound system. When she did that, it meant she had something serious on her mind. I pulled out my voice recorder from my jacket pocket, a trick I used for private conversations in case I needed to verify what I said later. "Ed, have you ever considered having an affair?" Grace asked. My first thought was wondering what prompted this question. My second was whether she was having an affair or knew someone who was. Why was this suddenly important enough to discuss? I had to push those questions aside before I could respond. "Grace, let's be honest," I said. "Everyone has thought about infidelity at some point. The real question is whether I've ever acted on it. And the answer is no." "Why not?" Grace pressed. "Because I made vows when we got married," I replied. "Those vows meant something to me then, and they still do." With society's changing views, Grace countered, "Marriage vows don't hold the same weight they used to. I think you should let go of them and seriously consider finding a compatible female lover. If you're worried about guilt, consider this my personal permission, with my unconditional blessing. Having an affair might help you appreciate our relationship even more and deepen your understanding of us as a couple. This way, you could enjoy the full value and pleasure of a relationship with the right woman without the burden of guilt." I struggled with her perspective because it seemed to suggest that using others for our own pleasure was acceptable to her. For me, it wasn't. This was a side of her I had never encountered before, and it changed my views significantly. "Answer me this, my loving wife," I said. "Why is it so important for you that I have an open affair with your approval? Have I done something so repulsive that you want to find a reason to end our marriage?" After 5 minutes of silence, I switched the sound system back on. The lack of response spoke volumes to me. Grace had always had something to say about everything, but now she was quiet. I couldn't help but wonder why. I was starting to believe there was a definite reason my loving wife wanted me to have an affair. But what could it be? No matter the reason, I was convinced that something in our lives was seriously off. I knew I had to uncover the truth. I drove for about an hour, and as we were around 40 miles from home, I noticed my wife turning the sound off again. I pulled out my recorder and switched it back on. "I'm sorry, Ed," Grace said. "I guess I've been reading too many romance novels. Those ideas must have come from nowhere." With that, she turned the sound system back on, thinking that would be the end of it. The problem was that our 3 children, and I knew she despised those books. They had been her mother's favorites. Throughout her life, she had always referred to them as trailer trash, insisting she was better than that. Whenever her mother passed the latest ones to her, Grace would bring them home and throw them in the trash. As I drove the final 40 miles, I realized that the one thing I knew little about was her Thursday nights out with the girls. It was never something we considered important or serious enough to worry about. On the rare occasions I was home, she would gladly adjust her schedule to stay with me. Until today, I had no reason to doubt those nights because I had trusted her completely. Now, however, due to our recent conversation, I found myself questioning what her Thursday nights really entailed. Was she going out bar hopping with the girls and forming questionable relationships, like one-night stands? I knew that by the time I got home, I needed to figure out what was happening during her girls' nights out. We arrived at our driveway just as our kids did with my parents. Once inside the house, I prepared rye and cokes for both of my parents. They shared stories about their weekend with the kids. For my parents, the time spent with their grandchildren was invaluable. As they mentioned, it was the grandkids who kept them feeling young and engaged. Each activity was tailored to their interests, exposing my parents to cultural experiences they had never encountered before. They stayed for about an hour before heading home, and I walked them back to their car. "Ed," my dad said quietly, "when would be a good time for us to drop by your office tomorrow for a private conversation?" "I have job interviews lined up all day," I replied. "How about around 3 o'clock? Whatever the issue is, I'm here to help." "The issue doesn't involve your mom and me," my dad whispered. "It concerns your wife and her youngest daughter. I shouldn't say more since your wife is watching us." "Okay, Dad, that works. I'll swing by after work, and we should be able to sort it out in about half an hour," I said loudly enough for Grace to hear through the window. After I watched them drive away, I went inside and grabbed the car keys. Then I picked up my toolbox and tossed it into the trunk. "Hey, honey," I said. "I need to stop by Dad's tomorrow to fix something for him after work, so I might be a little late." "I heard you from the window," Grace replied. "Don't worry about it. We can eat a bit later." My dad and mom arrived right on schedule and were escorted into my office. After they settled in, we waited for a staff member to bring us coffee. Once it was served, Kathy closed the office door behind her as she left. "Ed," my dad began, "I really regret my foolish decision to send in our grandchildren's DNA. They found a match for April. She has a grandmother on her father's side who is searching for her son and his descendants." He pulled out a form from Ancest.com revealing the woman's name and phone number. I was crushed, and my father could see the impact of the news on my face. "Dad, I don't think there was a mistake. Let's see what we can uncover," I replied. I used the office phone to call the number, putting it on speaker and recording the conversation to keep a permanent record. After 2 rings, it was answered. "My name is Edward Paul Adams, and I'm looking for Mrs. Beatrice Smith regarding a DNA match found through Ancest.com, I said. "Could I speak to her, please?" I asked. "You're speaking to her, young man," the woman replied. "What can I assist you with?" "It's a complicated situation," I said. "To make a long story short, I just learned that my youngest daughter is your granddaughter." "Are you referring to April Marie Adams?" she asked. "Yes, that's correct," I confirmed. "Then you might know my son, whom I had to give up for adoption when I was just 15, she said. I might if I knew his name, I responded. He was adopted by a family with the last name Barrow, and his name at that time was Luke Robert, Mrs. Smith stated. I turned pale, and my parents had tears in their eyes as we recognized the name all too well. Her candid comment had just turned into a nightmare for me. He's alive and doing well, I said. He's currently the district attorney here in Cape Girardeau County, Missouri, and he is also my wife's boss. I can tell you that he has never married. He's my only child, she said. I have stage 4 lung cancer and don't have much time left. Would you allow your daughter April to visit me before I pass? If you can't afford it, I'll gladly cover the ticket. I'd like to meet her to pass on my estate to her. Mrs. Smith, given the situation, I'll let you coordinate with my parents. Since you're only a state away, they can take her for a special weekend trip so you can meet her, I said. I don't think I'd be comfortable letting my daughter make the trip alone. Is there anything else you'd like me to do? Please arrange for a notary statement allowing my lawyer to conduct a DNA test, Mrs. Smith said. Because of the significance of April's inheritance, he'll need to verify that she is who we believe her to be before he can alter my will. No problem. I'll hand this call over to my dad, I said. He can sort out the details and get directions to you. I stood up, stepped outside my office, and handed Kathy my personal recorder, saying, please have both my conversation on this and the ongoing phone call transcribed and notarized. I need them prepared this way for the divorce court. Do you want me to arrange for the DNA test authorization as well? Kathy asked. Kathy was sharp. She recalled that when I activated the recorder, she was to listen quietly. This approach had helped resolve many conflicts quickly in the past. Yes, I replied, but we need to keep this under wraps for a few weeks. I want to find out what my soon-to-be ex-wife has been up to on Thursday nights. I walked into my assistant's office and said, David, I need to speak with you and your wife as soon as possible. I'm going to need both of your cooperation regarding a personal matter. David looked at me, immediately sensing that whatever I required help with was serious. She should be finishing up dispatching shortly, David said. I'll text her to come right over. I returned to my office and we made arrangements. Using the house key they had for my place, they planned to pack some clothes for April and leave next Friday. I would pick her up from school and drop her off at their home by 10 o'clock. I was seeing my parents out the door when David's wife arrived. I instructed her to go into his office, assuring her that I would join them shortly. Thanks to modern communication methods, Kathy had already made copies and transcribed everything. I handed a copy to David and Cheryl to review, suggesting they read the conversation between my wife and me first. I also gave Kathy the document my dad had provided for photocopying what he had received for my lawyer's file that we were compiling, and instructed her to find the best lawyer available. Cheryl and David had both known my wife and me for many years, and they took today's revelations quite hard. Cheryl and Grace grew up as neighbors. Although they were never particularly close, they were well aware of each other's lives. It was a shock for Cheryl to confront the reality of what had previously been unknown. Do you think there's still a chance they might be lovers after all this time? Cheryl asked. Or do you think it was just a case of getting caught up in something and then realizing it was a mistake? I'm not sure, but I'll need both of your help to find out, I replied. For the next few weeks, David will need to use my company car for sales trips. Cheryl, I'll need to borrow your car since it won't raise any suspicion. Cheryl, I'll need to borrow your car since it won't raise any suspicion. This means you'll have to drive David's car. I'll inform the company that this is part of David's cross-training. So unfortunately, he'll be stuck with this for the next 3 months. You're going to follow your wife on Thursday nights and document everything you can, David suggested. Your wife will still think you're away on business. I have a feeling it's still happening because why else would my wife suddenly suggest I have an affair with her approval, I said. If Barrow hadn't changed jobs, nothing would have shifted. I believe Grace might be planning to move with Luke Robert Barrow, when he starts working in St. Louis. If Grace can prove I'm having an affair, it would give her justification for filing for divorce. Wow, Cheryl remarked. I can totally see Grace doing something like that. In today's society, it's become acceptable to accuse someone else of what you've already done. It's a clever way to deflect attention from your own actions. Ed, if you find evidence during one of these Thursday nights, Cheryl continued, call me, and I'll arrange for a couple of officers to visit her and her partner, claiming you were in a car accident. This way I can get you a detailed police report about their attire and where they were found. Some of the officers would love to get back at the district attorney for past grievances. Kathy checked in on us and said, Dale Allen Britton left the district attorney's office 4 months ago because he could no longer work with him, and he has started his own practice. I faxed him everything we have so far, and he's waiting for you. You should head over there, Ed. Please send Dale my love and best wishes, Cheryl said, and let him know that we still miss him. I walked out the door to meet the man who was taking the women's rights movement to the Supreme Court regarding Roe v. Wade. His perspective on the law and its application was turning everything he touched upside down. Things were starting to make sense. Grace and I began having marital issues shortly after she started working for Luke Barrow. Coincidentally, that was around the same time I got promoted to sales manager, which required me to go on 24-hour trips for sales meetings. If they were still having an affair every Thursday night, I had unknowingly been a witness for over 15 years. They must have been laughing about me behind my back. Now, the expensive Christmas and birthday gifts from Luke to her finally made sense. Dale was waiting for me when I got out of the car. I found out that Cheryl had informed him about our plans. He even provided me with access to Luke Barrow's house and the code to disable the alarm if it was set. He handed me a piece of paper with a phone number, saying it would connect me with those who could help at a reasonable cost. He had spoken to them, and they were expecting my call. He explained that he grew up on the streets and still had connections to get things done. The access codes for Barrow's home would remain valid until the end of next week, after which Luke would receive his monthly reminder to change his codes. Dale planned to sue Barrow for child support from the day April was born, which would be very costly for Luke. Under state law, this debt couldn't be eliminated by declaring bankruptcy. If Dale succeeded, his former boss would be broke before it was over. He intended to sue my wife Grace for inappropriate relationships, marital abandonment, and fraud for falsely presenting Luke Barrow's daughter as mine. It was Dale who suggested we temporarily sign over my parental rights for April to my parents until the court case was resolved. I asked him why. Dale explained that this way they can't accuse you of using April against them. I know Luke will come after you in the dirtiest, meanest way possible, treating you like he does all the lowlifes, handing out maximum sentences for the smallest offenses. Sometimes the best defense is a strong offense. I offered to use my debit card for a down payment on his services, but he declined, saying your wife would see it immediately and might figure out what you're doing. Instead, he suggested I write him a check that he would hold until after they were served. As soon as I left, I realized that everything he was doing was aimed at giving me an advantage in time to gather information. Kathy had truly found the best for me. I left with the sense that Dale had his own motives for pursuing Luke Barrow as he was. Both Grace and Luke were about to face a flood of consequences they never anticipated. Dale Britton had just devised his own version of the divorce game. I had completed all the necessary paperwork so that my parents would gain parental rights over April starting Friday, and I had provided them with a copy. After Dale and I explained the entire situation, they agreed that it made sense. I was waiting for Cheryl to arrive in her 2002 Ford Taurus. David was away on his first sales trip. Cheryl would leave her car with me and take David's car home. My oldest child had informed me that their mother wouldn't be home for dinner since she was planning to meet up with the girls right after work. As soon as Cheryl got there, we made the switch and I tossed my suitcase into the trunk. Cheryl said, "Dispatch, and the guys are ready. I just need to know the location." "Thanks," I replied. Dale mentioned I should call him if it's a go so he can serve them personally. I'm curious why Dale wants to take down Luke Barrow. For Dale, it's a matter of principle, Cheryl explained. Luke struggles to stand by what he says. It was exciting to watch Grace and Luke drive off in different cars. They both headed to Charlie's Grill Bar, where they tasted an excellent steak. After that, their paths parted. I drove to Luke Barrow's and waited. Dale's friends, who are now part of my team, had prepared everything. I found a safe place where I had a good view of Luke's house. Grace arrived first. After entering the code to disable the alarm, she opened the door with her key. We filmed her long enough to see her go inside. 10 minutes later, Luke pulled up. Grace opened the door to greet him. They started kissing. I stopped filming as soon as they closed the door. 6 of the 8 rooms in Luke's house have been equipped for video and audio recording. The son of Luke Barrow's neighbor was serving a long sentence and had agreed to let us use his house as our headquarters. Everything captured inside Barrow's home was being streamed live to any Facebook page they were linked with. We found out that they had a team trailing my car because Grace suspected I would fall for the trap and start searching for a new romantic interest tonight. Knowing my schedule, they had positioned the escort they hired, as she was familiar with my preferences. I sent a message to Cheryl to let her know what I had just overheard. She immediately called her husband David to inform him that he was being watched. As a former Marine, he took swift action and deliberately drove his car off the road at 10 o'clock at night. After that, he had to call for a tow truck to get him back on the road. He then called his wife to report the incident, and she texted me back. I confirmed it was a go and provided the address. While waiting for things to unfold, I slipped over to Barrow's house and removed the valve stems from all the tires on their car to prevent them from getting a chance to clean up the mess they were about to face. The lovers would be stuck for quite some time. When the police arrived, they knocked on the door with their blue lights flashing, searching for Grace Adams. Luke Barrows attempted to deny that she was there until the officers pointed out that her car was in the driveway. Eventually, Grace came to the door, wrapped in nothing but a bedsheet. Mrs. Grace Adams, your husband Edward Paul's car was involved in a motor vehicle accident just outside Little Rock, Arkansas. Your parents suggested we check here when we couldn't find you, the officer said. I took great satisfaction in watching Grace's face turn pale. The officer had intentionally missiled her to create some discomfort for both of them. After that, the police got into their cruiser and drove away, with me following closely behind. The entire encounter from the time the police arrived until they left was recorded and live-streamed on Facebook. We had proof that the affair was still ongoing, and so did the good people of Cape. At midnight, my oldest daughter, Amy, called me. Dad, Mom's not home yet, and my calls are going to her voicemail. I'm getting worried she's usually not this late. What should I do? I replied, texting her the number. What's her boss got to do with this? Amy asked. He's been her Thursday night boyfriend for over 16 years, I said. I ended the call and texted Amy part of the video clip showing Grace in a bedsheet talking to the police, while Luke Barrow was only in a pair of pajama bottoms, all from a burner phone. 10 minutes later, Amy called again and said, Mom's phone suddenly started working again. She called me and said she was on Lower East Broadway with 4 flat tires. I knew she was lying and told her that couldn't be true since it's nowhere near Luke Barrow's place. She insisted she was telling the truth, so I mentioned that I saw a clip of her and her lover talking to the cops. When she asked what clip, I sent it to her. Mom couldn't explain why she was wrapped in a bedsheet. I wouldn't expect her home for hours, but could you do me a favor and open the front door? I asked. I was getting out of the car when my daughter Amy spotted me. She watched as I retrieved my suitcase from the trunk and walked toward her. No sooner had I set the suitcase down than my cell phone rang. It was Dale Allen Britton. I answered and switched to speaker mode. Ed, I just served them both at his house, Dale said. Your wife and her lover are now prohibited from being within 500 feet of you or any of your children. I'll notify the Cape Police Department before heading back home. Do yourself a favor and don't talk to her at all, Dale added. If she shows up, even to get her clothes, call the cops. Understood. And so does my oldest daughter, I replied. Thanks, Dale. Amy, go open the garage so I can move Cheryl's car in, I instructed. I'm supposed to be in Little Rock. So that's what we did. Dad, is that why the locksmith came around 6 to change the locks? Amy asked. Yes, it was a last-minute decision, I said. I asked Kathy to arrange it because it was becoming clear that things were going down as we planned. What triggered all of this? Amy inquired. The DNA test your grandfather sent to Angstry, I explained. They found a match for April. He told me about it at work on Monday. When I contacted the woman, I discovered that your mother's boss is her son, whom she gave up for adoption when she was 15. My daughter Amy lost it. I held her tightly until she calmed down. Then we dimmed the lights and went into the kitchen to talk quietly. I activated my voice recorder and let Amy listen to the conversation I had with her mother while we were driving back from Nashville. Hearing her mother's words directly was quite revealing. Why would Mom want you to have an affair, Dad? Amy asked. To avoid facing the consequences of her own actions if they were ever discovered, I replied. It's unfortunate that her suggestion led to the truth being exposed. There was a soft knock at the door. Since I wasn't supposed to be home, Amy went to answer it. A police officer was at the door informing us that they had stopped a taxi with Grace in it and warned her that proceeding further would violate a court order. My eldest daughter and I talked about everything for the rest of the night. We both agreed that Grace would have made a great writer since she always had a story to share from her girls' nights out. I still can't believe Mom has been having an affair with the same man for over 16 years, Amy said. Why didn't we notice? It was simple, I replied. You kids were young, and I was a sales manager who had to travel every week for meetings in different states. Out of trust in our relationship, I saw no reason not to let your mother have her weekly night out with the girls. We all trusted her, Annie added. That's what made us blind to what was happening behind the scenes. I sat there in disbelief. If Amy hadn't pointed it out, I might never have realized. It was her manipulation of our trust that allowed her to carry on for so long. Seeing the tears welling in my eyes, Amy said, "That's what hurts the most. It's not just the affair or the lies. It's realizing she used our faith in her as a tool to maintain the only relationship that mattered to her. If your mother could do that to someone she claimed to love," I said, "imagine what she'll do to us when she starts to resent us for what she's going through." Amy got up to make us both fresh cups of coffee. That's when I noticed the dawn breaking. I received a text notification on my cell phone. "It's from your mother. She wants to talk to me as soon as possible," I said. "She says there's a problem at home with our oldest child that we need to discuss before I return from my trip." "How are you going to respond?" my daughter asked, concern evident in her voice. "Don't worry, be happy. You and Luke can still laugh about the big doofus behind my back," I said as I typed. "You can still move to St. Louis with Luke Barrow, just not with our kids." Amy stared at me in shock. "Your mother doesn't need me anymore," I explained. "My usefulness to her has ended. She wanted me to start an affair so she could use it against me in divorce court. She never considered that she would eventually be caught." It must have been painful for Amy to hear the words I sent to her mother. Few can face the harsh truth of a situation. Most resort to calling the one who reveals it all kinds of names because the truth can be painful. Acceptance often comes with time. I stood up and embraced my daughter as she began to cry again. We had managed to calm her down when we heard Eric and April stirring. I switched on the kitchen TV to KVOS 12 to catch the local morning news, as I usually did. Before long, they came downstairs for breakfast, surprised to see me at home. We were all taken aback when my wife's image appeared on the screen. My son turned up the volume out of curiosity. I felt a pang of sympathy for my kids at that moment because Luke and she were mocking me. Grace bluntly remarked, The doofus is such a moron that he is completely oblivious to everything happening around him. Their mother then made a sarcastic comment about me that had them both laughing. Then the reporter spoke. "I don't think they're laughing anymore," he said. After 5 hours of live coverage of the longtime lover's antics on Facebook, their plan to set Edward Adams up with a professional escort so she could divorce him and take everything he owned has backfired spectacularly. The next scene showed Dale delivering the lawsuits to them. The news reporter explained the nature of the lawsuits. Alice ran over to me and sat on my lap, crying. It was a harsh way for a 16-year-old to discover that her father wasn't her biological parent. Her mother's long-term lover was. Eric summarized it perfectly when he said, "If you're just a piece of garbage in Mom's eyes, what does that make the rest of us?" Once April had calmed down, Amy helped me explain everything that had happened since their mother and I began our journey back from Nashville. I contacted their school and arranged for them to be excused from classes on Friday and Monday to allow them time to adjust and process their emotions. Just as we were about to start breakfast, April said, "Dad, the police chief is on TV." That caught our attention, so we turned the volume back up. The news was now publicly announcing that both Grace Adams and Luke Barrow, our current district attorney, were under criminal investigation. A special task force from another county was being assembled to lead the inquiry. I reflected that when someone's behavior becomes public knowledge, society struggles to reconcile their private actions. Hypocrisy governs our daily lives. After breakfast and tidying up, I had my 3 children sit at the table. I shared with each of them a copy of the letter my dad had received. I then said, "April, my parents are coming to take you to meet your biological father's mother. She is terminally ill and wishes to see you. There is a significant reason for this, but I believe it's best for her to explain it to you. As far as I'm concerned, you are my daughter and always will be. If you have any questions, feel free to ask your grandparents. Amy, could you help your sister pack for the weekend while I call my parents?" I asked. Once the girls left, my son said, "How are you handling this, Dad?" "I'm not," I replied. "I find myself in a constant struggle to maintain control. Remember, son, if you ever find yourself in a similar situation, as a father, you must remain strong for everyone else in your life." With that, I called my parents and explained the situation. They said they would come right over as soon as they finished loading their car, and they had an hour before their flight. I didn't realize that at that moment, my relationship with my son had changed forever for the better. The 3 of us watched as the daughter I had raised left with my parents to meet her biological grandmother for the first time. I was primarily praying for a positive experience and hoping she would return feeling the same way about me. At the local district attorney's office, the atmosphere was as cold as a morgue. Grace Adams had gone out to buy new clothes after having her car towed and her 4 tire stems replaced. Luke Barrow was reviewing the lawsuit against him. Although they lacked a direct DNA sample, they had established a biological connection that made it impossible for him to deny his paternity. Everyone on staff was now aware of the truth regarding their relationship and long-term affair. This, along with the concealed parentage of April Adams, was turning into a political disaster. Over time, the definition of fraud had expanded under the law to include failing to disclose all relevant facts about a situation. Dale was suing both Grace and Luke jointly in a civil lawsuit. It increasingly appeared that the couple had been deceiving her husband, Ed, for years. Every lawyer he contacted informed him that Ed Adams and Dale Britton were likely to succeed in their case. Those same lawyers wanted nothing to do with it, as many had already heard about Dale's past as a defendant. It was noted that most defenses relied on the assumption that a specific pattern of facts could be argued. However, when Dale presented his arguments in court, most found they had no defense by the time he finished. The exposure of their behavior on Facebook, along with the clear admission from both that they were attempting to ruin an honest man to gain access to his assets, might not have carried much weight. However, due to his social standing, it became front-page news. Grace had just exited the store where she had shopped for years, drawn by the quality and uniqueness of its clothing lines. To her surprise, a woman approached her and questioned whether she was out of her mind, implying that Grace should have known things would end badly. When Grace asked about the woman's comments, she found out how she bluntly stated that Grace had been a star on Facebook for at least 5 hours. Returning to Luke's house around 1 p.m., Grace found that a service company was concluding a visit. They had mistakenly assumed she was the homeowner and recommended that she and her husband reset all the security codes. It wasn't until after they left that Grace realized she hadn't been asked to confirm their visit with an electronic signature. She called Luke, expressing concern about his new position in St. Louis. When he asked why, she recounted her experience upon returning home. That's when they both began to suspect that there was more at play than just Ed looking out for himself, as they both knew his new job was a political appointment tied to the deep state. After preparing a cup of coffee, she settled down to review the divorce petition. The first shock came when she realized that her own words to her husband had raised his suspicions. He was questioning why she had encouraged him to intentionally harm and manipulate another person for his own gratification. However, the real blow was that Mr. and Mrs. Adams had informed him of the DNA match from Angstry, leading him to uncover April's true parentage and giving him undeniable evidence of her affair. Grace began to comprehend that Ed must now understand that her actions had nearly destroyed their relationship even before April was born. In that moment, she grasped that Ed needed to know if the affair was still ongoing. He had orchestrated the events of the previous night and was the one revealing the hidden truths about her life. Just as she took another sip of her coffee, the doorbell rang. Rising to answer it, she found it was the neighbor next door whom Luke disliked. "Mr. Primrose," she greeted him. "How can I help you?" He handed her a legal envelope and said, "Ed, your husband used my place as a base for his operations against you and your long-term lover last night. I allowed him to do so because Luke Barrow got my son the maximum sentence as a first-time offender. I thought you'd like to know that the information in the envelope I gave you was created last night and is also being sent by courier to everyone on your side of the family this afternoon. Ed wanted me to ask if you're still laughing at him now." She watched him walk away, a broad smile on his face. Back in the kitchen, Grace opened the envelope that contained the photos. The pictures began with her entering Luke's house with her key, and then she greeted him at the door when he returned home. There were photos of their infidelity. The images left no room for imagination, even at the moment when they encountered the police. Ed's team were experts. Their work was so thorough that it seemed as if he was cooperating with the cops, pursuing revenge on Luke for their own reasons. However, it was the last printed page, signed by her husband, that revealed the true problem. If this information became public, it would lead to a lot of problems that they did not expect. Her attempts to force her husband to comply with her demands led to impressive consequences. The pressing question now was how to mitigate the consequences of Ed turning this into a public spectacle. "Grace, I realized last Sunday when we returned home from Nashville that you were trying to set me up to justify your decision to divorce me. Since then, I've been reflecting on what I might have done to turn your love into pure hatred. Now I understand why. I see that you hold me responsible for the things you feel were missing in your life when we only had 2 children. I believe you felt trapped in the marriage and wanted to reclaim your carefree single life. If that weren't the case, you wouldn't have sought him out to rediscover that life. By doing so, you allowed him to take you away from what you despised for a few hours each week. I know the only reason you remained in a marriage with a man you loathed, whom you considered dead, was that Luke didn't want the responsibility of raising children, not even his own. With your perception of me, there was no way you would leave our kids with someone like me. Your pride wouldn't permit it, which led to a lifetime of intentional lies. With each day you both got away with it, your disdain for who I am intensified. In your eyes, I became a greater fool and idiot. How often did you and Luke laugh about the unsuspecting cuck? Did you inspire his intimacy with you by belittling or mocking me? What I can't forgive or forget is the message you and the man you see as your true husband have sent to our children, as it will impact them for the rest of their lives. I still can't figure out how much amusement you and Luke derived from manipulating our lives and our children's lives as if we were mere chess pieces on a game board. The KVOS 12 news reporter captured it perfectly when he asked the two of you if you were still laughing at Grace Adams' husband, Edward Adams. I observed as Amy, Eric, and April watched you and your partner reveal your plans for me publicly, aided by the mass media. It was heartbreaking to see our children while you joked and laughed about how simple it would be to take down the foolish, incompetent fool. Eric, our only son, remarked, "If our mother thinks you're nothing more than a worthless piece of trash that should dry out before being crushed into the ground, what does she truly think of us? I haven't inquired about what your future relationship with them will be. For now, I can honestly say it's non-existent. The sheer disgust and disdain you and your partner, Luke, have shown towards me have ensured that. At least we both understand that you are reveling in joy, having left me with a reputation of being a clueless idiot for the rest of my days. Perhaps tonight the two of you can toast to your victory." Grace's hands shook uncontrollably, causing her to drop the paper. She came across as spiteful, bitter, hateful, and cruel. Someone who was completely uncaring. It was evident that she portrayed a mother indifferent to her children, husband, or anyone else. Her only concern was for herself and fulfilling her own desires. Then her sobs shattered the silence in the room. Ed was the only person she knew who could undermine someone's credibility without directly condemning them. Anyone reading the document could not argue against his observations regarding their behavior. To Ed, everything she had done was merely to maintain her lifestyle, not out of love. He must have realized that it was Luke who was pressuring her to leave him and the kids before she became pregnant with April. Luke's new job had forced them to accelerate their long-term plans. Initially, they had intended to wait until April graduated high school, when her true parentage could be disclosed without serious repercussions. He was right to some extent. She certainly wasn't laughing now. He had effectively pointed out that their own actions validated what he had written. Ed believed that their disdain for who he was the reason they were trying to bring him down completely. Without explicitly saying so, it felt like a declaration of war. If he was going to fall, he would make sure to take both of them down with him. Grace picked up the divorce petition and continued reading. It was truly devastating. One of the allegations against them was fraud for concealing April's true parentage. She was being accused of emotional and mental abandonment, adultery, and slander. But when she saw the amount they were demanding in damages for the fraud case, she felt nauseated. If Ed won both, she and Luke would be left financially devastated for a long time. Ed and his attorney were demonstrating that they could no longer dismiss Ed as the fool they believed him to be. Saturday was chaotic for my two oldest children and me. From early morning until about 4 in the afternoon, family members dropped by to show their support. Grace's parents, her 2 brothers, 1 sister, and their spouses all came, each bringing one of their favorite dishes to ensure we had enough to eat. Even my brother and sister traveled from out of town to check on me. We were surrounded by love and support, but everyone who visited struggled to understand how they had been misled by Grace for so long. They all agreed that the information shared on social media was clear evidence of her intent to harm me out of spite. My father-in-law and I stepped outside for a moment with cold beers on the back deck. "Edward, let it go," he said. "Cora is inside to give you some privacy, and we'll keep everyone away until you're settled down." He stayed with me until things calmed down. "Cora and I are planning to update our will," he said. "What would have been Grace's share will now be divided among your 3 children. She may be our daughter, but I will never forgive her for what she has become." Just as we finished emptying the house, my father called. "April met the lady," he said. "You can definitely see some family resemblance." Their meeting went well. Mrs. Smith seemed interested in your family's situation and got April to open up about her feelings. It was good to see, as she had been holding it all in. My dad said, The lawyer got the blood sample he needed and then took me aside for a private conversation. He inquired about Luke Barrow, and I shared what we all knew. I discovered that Luke's real father is serving a life sentence for murdering his lover's husband. Luke would have inherited his biological mother's estate if April hadn't entered her life. "Don't worry, Dad," I assured him. "Dale Britton has a court order against him, prohibiting him from coming within 500 feet of any of us." It's been a hectic day. A lot of family members from both sides have come to show their support. Mrs. Smith is hosting us at her estate. "Your mother feels privileged to be treated so royally," Dad explained. "April is with Mrs. Smith right now, and we both like her." Her lawyer mentioned it had been a long time since he'd seen a smile on the grand lady's face. "Hold on, I'm going to pass the phone to your mom." "Ed, I had the opportunity to talk to Beatrice alone for a bit. She asked me what kind of son you were, so I shared details about your life as openly and honestly as I could. We discussed in depth what happened over the past week. She mentioned you left it to her to explain to April why she wanted to see her. Beatrice said it had been a while since a stranger showed her such respect, and thanked all of us for guiding her on how to handle her estate. Her plan is to place it all in a trust in April's name, managed by you, until she turns 25. I asked her to text me when they leave so I can be sure to be home when they bring her back," I said before ending the call. I messaged April, letting her know that we all miss her and are sending love from Dad. Finally, we had a moment to tidy up before David and Cheryl arrived with my car. I had to apologize to her for forgetting to return it. "The police chief sees a chance to take down Luke Barrow," Cheryl noted. "He and Dale are collaborating. Dale has provided him with some questionable information for the investigators to examine." "The staff looked somber and upset when I returned," David mentioned. I informed them that some of us had been aware of the situation for most of the week and were doing what we could to help. "It's been an emotional roller coaster since Thursday night," I replied. "The kids are still struggling to cope at times, so I'll be taking Monday off as well." "Have you heard from Grace at all?" Cheryl asked. "Not since Thursday night," I responded. "Luke and she are probably too busy moving on with their lives, especially since they've made their views about us publicly clear." My youngest daughter called me early Sunday morning to ask if it would be all right for her and her grandparents to return home late on Monday. I gave my approval, provided her grandparents agreed as well. She thanked me for encouraging her to go. I inquired about the reason behind her gratitude. April explained that Mrs. Smith helped me realize that it wasn't my fault that I came into this world because of her mother's affair. Mrs. Smith made it clear, "Dad, that we are all innocent victims who don't deserve what has happened to us because of the actions of her son and my mother." "I love you, Daddy," she said before ending the call. On Monday evening, Amy, Eric, and I watched my parents pull into our driveway. They looked exhausted and stressed. As soon as my mom got out of the car, she rushed into my arms. I have to admit, it felt wonderful to have my youngest daughter back home. My dad opened the trunk and brought in her suitcase, while Eric immediately took it to her bedroom. After that, the three of them went into the family room so April could share stories about her new grandmother, giving my parents and me a moment to catch up. We moved to the kitchen where I brewed a fresh pot of coffee as my parents shared their thoughts on Mrs. Beatrice Smith. She seemed at peace when we left, my dad said. It was as if she had come to terms with her impending death. Meeting April and her acceptance meant a lot to her. Mom pulled a legal-sized envelope from her purse and handed it to me, explaining, "Her lawyer gave this to me following Beatrice's instructions." I opened the envelope and found a letter inside, along with a check for $50,000. The letter was brief and straightforward. The grand lady expressed her gratitude for fulfilling her request, informing me that she had already surpassed her expected lifespan before I reached out. DNA had confirmed our biological connection. She praised April as a lovely young woman and said I had raised her well. She advised me to use the funds to help us through this challenging time and to always stay true to my values. I let my parents read the letter. It was difficult to wrap my mind around the idea that we may have fulfilled someone's last request. While we enjoy our coffee, I shared everything that had happened during their trip. I reassured them that I felt the worst was behind us emotionally as a family, and that starting tomorrow, we would return to our normal routine. For the remainder of the week, things went relatively smoothly under the circumstances. Grace attempted to contact each of our children via cell phone, but they essentially told her not to call again. The corporate headquarters was thrilled that I was no longer responsible for the sales meeting and began searching for a sales manager for the first time in a decade. I was in my office going over some monthly sales reports when Kathy poked her head through the door and said, "Things have gotten out of hand." I looked up and asked, "What now?" "I received an email saying your last letter to Grace was posted online on a southeastern Missouri newspaper's website." I went to the site and found a section titled "Speak Out," where I discovered the letter. Kathy came around my desk and read it over my shoulder. By the time she finished, she was in tears. I wrote that when I was feeling emotional, I explained, maybe I was a bit harsh. "No, Ed," Kathy replied. "You just presented her long-term behavior in a blunt and honest way. Either one of them could have put an end to it and come clean." Luke benefited from a long-term relationship without bearing any of the costs. "That's how I saw it," I agreed. "It's not often that society gets to witness the impact of someone's actions on their family so publicly," Kathy remarked. "For everyone who has been divorced, like me, it serves as a stark reminder of the pain and suffering they endured before they could move on." "Check out the last comment posted," I said, reading it aloud. "As a lifelong feminist, I have fought for equality and empowerment. What this woman and her lover did to her husband and children has forever tarnished our movement." Grace and Luke were dining at Charlie's Bar and Grill, typically bustling on Friday nights. The restaurant was unusually quiet, with only empty tables surrounding them. When they inquired with the waitress about the lack of patrons, she explained that people were waiting but refused to be seen sitting near them. She mentioned that many had read the article featuring Mr. Adams' last letter to Mrs. Adams on the Southeast Missourian newspaper website. After asking for the bill, Grace and Luke hurriedly left, realizing they needed to avoid public places for a while. They were both struggling to accept that their actions had significantly narrowed their world. As they exited, Grace spotted her parents sitting at a table, waiting for their meal. She approached them, and Luke followed. Upon seeing them, her father said, "Mr. Barrow, I suggest you take your girl of easy virtue and leave so my wife and I can enjoy our meal in peace." Grace walked out of the restaurant in tears, finally understanding that some actions are irreversible. She would have to live with the consequences of what she and Luke had done. Once they returned to Luke's place, they went online to see the comments for themselves. It was evident to both of them that the public harbored intense disdain for them. 3 months later, I sat in the passenger seat of my car, watching April as she drove. We had left that morning for Wichita, Kansas, after hearing about the passing of her grandmother, Beatrice. Our destination was the airport to board the private plane the estate had arranged for us. April was taking the news hard, especially since they had grown close through their frequent phone calls after her last visit. Amy and Eric had been incredibly supportive, which brought the 4 of us closer together. They were encouraging me to start dating, but I had been taking a more relaxed approach to it. Once bitten, twice shy. Luke and Grace had relocated to St. Louis. The feds had allowed Luke to begin his job early, and the county was eager to rid themselves of him, provided he paid back over $45,000 in questionable expenses. They were now living in a 2-bedroom apartment they rented, preparing for the possibility of declaring bankruptcy due to the upcoming civil suit. According to Missouri bankruptcy laws, they could only retain $10,000 each in equity. Our divorce was finalized according to state law. Grace was required to pay me child support while the kids were in school and to cover 50% of their living expenses if they stayed on campus. The civil trial for fraud was set to start in 2 weeks. My children continued to refuse to speak to their mother, and her family was also estranged from her. She learned the hard way that people can only tolerate so much nonsense before deciding to walk away for good. April had to attend a meeting arranged by the state's child services with her biological father, which did not go well for him. She told him that her mother had said he was just like his real father, an egotist who shouldn't be near any woman. In front of the child services representatives, April stated that both her mother and he were dead to her. We went to her grandmother's funeral, and afterward, the lawyer informed us of the significant inheritance she would receive, which was quite overwhelming for both of us. As the trustee, I discussed it with my daughter, and we agreed to sell her grandmother's house along with its contents, except for her personal jewelry and a few photos that April wanted. Once we returned home, and the school year was coming to an end, I was preparing for the first day of court on Wednesday when April entered the den. "Dad, can you arrange a meeting with Luke, Mom, their lawyers, and us along with Dale on Tuesday?" "Luke, Mom, their lawyers, and us along with Dale on Tuesday?" April asked. "I think I can, but why?" I replied. "I want them to understand the true consequences of their actions," April said. "Grandma Beatrice suggested this to me, so I called Dale, and we agreed on this." It was a bright, sunny day when we met with Luke, Grace, and their lawyers. "I asked for this meeting," April said, "to my biological father. First of all, I want to tell you this. This is the location of your father and his request that you visit him in prison. He is serving a life sentence for the murder of his lover's husband." April handed him a sealed envelope with his name on it. I liked the look on Luke and Grace's faces. "Both of you should know that my biological grandmother left me over $100 million, which will be held in trust by my father, Edward Adams, until I turn 25 years old. It would have been your hatch if she hadn't discovered me," April said. "When she found out how I was created, and as a result, her views on moral principles and norms changed. That's when she crossed you out. In my grandmother's eyes, what you both did was disgusting. Dale Britton, whom I trust, will pay my father's legal bills," April said. "Luke, Mom, you could try mediation before going to court because if necessary, we will go to the Supreme Court. Mom, you have to understand that even if you created me in sin, that doesn't give you the right to think that it's acceptable. Fortunately, my biological grandmother helped me understand that it was my father's views on morality, principles, and standards that shaped me. I left this meeting proud, and at the same time humiliated. What happened tomorrow didn't matter, because today I was blessed with what really mattered," my daughter said. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.